Where is she? Four of the most powerful men in Las Vegas froze in their seats. They had never witnessed Emilio Rixa like this before, those dark eyes now burning crimson. His fingers gripping the oak table's edge until blood seeped through, his voice trembling as if containing an inferno within his chest. In Las Vegas, there was an unspoken rule everyone knew, but no one dared to voice. Never mention the name Emilio Rixa after midnight. Yet tonight, the man who once made this city of sin bow in silence was shaking. He was afraid. Basement level B2, boss. Security cameras captured someone attacking. Emilio didn't wait for the rest. He bolted from the room. 33 years on this earth, he had never run for anyone. But 47 seconds later, when he found her lying face down on the cold concrete floor, her elegant evening gown torn apart, her chestnut brown hair stained crimson by spreading blood, his heart stopped. Vivian Ashford, the woman he had been silently watching for 4 long months. The only woman in this world who still kept his business card in her wallet. She lay there, alone in the darkness, just as she had existed for the past 12 years. And in that moment, Emilio Rixa, the most ruthless crime lord in Nevada, realized a truth more terrifying than any enemy. Will Vivian wake up? And what secret lies behind the business card she kept for 4 months? If you want to find out, hit that like button, share this video, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Emilio dropped to his knees beside Vivian, his knees striking the freezing concrete floor, but he didn't feel the pain at all. His hand trembled as he lifted it to her nose, trying to find the faintest trace of breath. A weak current of warm air brushed against his skin, and Emilio let out a breath as if the whole world had just been placed back into his hands. She was still breathing, she was still alive. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse, and felt the faint but steady beat of a heart still struggling to hold on to life. His hand wouldn't stop shaking, something that had never happened in 15 years of ruling the underworld. Emilio Rixa, the man who had once stared down the barrel of a gun without blinking, was now quivering because of a woman lying motionless before him. Nico and 3 other bodyguards came running over, stopping several steps away. They stood frozen like statues, unable to believe what they were seeing. Their boss, the man before whom all of Las Vegas bowed its head, was kneeling beside a woman with bloodshot eyes and shaking hands. Emilio lifted his head, his voice as cold as ice, yet carrying a command that couldn't be questioned. Call Helena Price right now. Tell her to get to the desert estate within 40 minutes. Nico immediately pulled out his phone, but he still couldn't hide his confusion. Boss, the hospital is closer. We can get her there in 10 minutes. Emilio rose to his feet and gently slid one arm beneath Vivian's knees, while the other supported her back, lifting her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. No hospital. The attacker may have people there. I won't take the risk. He walked on, holding Vivian tightly against his chest, feeling the fragile warmth of her body. Nico ran after him and opened the car door, and for the first time in 10 years of working together, Nico witnessed the impossible. Emilio Rixa climbed into the back seat instead of driving himself. He laid Vivian across his lap, one hand holding her firmly, while the other brushed the blood-stained strands of hair away from her face. Drive, as fast as you can. Emilio's voice was low and rough. Nico started the engine and shot out of the building at full speed. In the rearview mirror, he glanced at his boss and saw an image he had never seen before. Emilio didn't take his eyes off Vivian's face, his thumb lightly stroking her cheek as if he were trying to breathe life back into her with the force of his own existence. Who is she, boss? Nico asked carefully. Silence stretched between them. Emilio didn't answer directly. He only looked down at Vivian's pale face, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the coldest threat Nico had ever heard. If she doesn't make it through the night, all of Las Vegas will learn what hell is. The car tore through the brightly lit streets of Las Vegas, and then slowly the blazing neon lights faded behind them, giving way to the darkness of the Nevada desert. The desert night was cold and still, with only the roar of the engine ripping through the silence. The stars glittered across the sky, indifferent as they looked down on the car carrying 2 fates that were about to become entwined. 38 minutes later, the car stopped in front of an estate hidden in the vast desert. There were no neighbors within 5 miles, no streetlights, only the pale moonlight pouring down over the solitary roof. This was where Emilio came when he wanted to escape the world, when he wanted to remember that he was still human, and not only a name that inspired fear. Dr. Helena Price was already waiting at the door, a medical bag in her hand. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-white hair and sharp eyes, the only person outside his family whom Emilio trusted completely. She didn't ask questions, didn't show surprise, but immediately led Emilio into the living room that had already been prepared like a small emergency ward. Emilio laid Vivian down on the bed and stepped back to let Helena work, but he didn't leave the room. He stood there with his back against the wall, his eyes never leaving Vivian's unconscious face, while Helena examined her wounds, started an intravenous line, and treated the cuts across her body. An hour passed in strained silence. At last, Helena stood up, removed her gloves, and turned to Emilio. She has a head injury, but it isn't life-threatening. She has quite a few surface wounds, but none of them are deep. She needs rest. She may remain unconscious for a few more hours. Helena looked into Emilio's eyes and her voice softened. She's going to be all right. You should get some rest. Emilio shook his head. I'll stay here. Helena sighed, knowing that no words could change the mind of this man. She packed up her things, left behind some medicine and instructions for care, then departed into the dark night. The room sank into stillness. Emilio pulled a chair over beside the bed and sat down, his eyes never leaving Vivian's face. She lay there with her chestnut brown hair spread across the white pillow, her face pale yet peaceful in sleep. He studied every detail of her features, the way her eyelashes trembled faintly, the way her lips moved just a little, as though she were saying something in a dream. As the night deepened, Vivian shifted, her brow drawing together as though she were trapped in a nightmare. Emilio didn't think. He reached out and took her small hand in his. Her hand was cold, her slender fingers fitting inside his rough palm. Strangely, the moment he held her hand, Vivian's face slowly relaxed and her breathing grew steadier, as though she could feel someone's presence beside her. Emilio sat there all through the night, not sleeping, not leaving. Moonlight slipped through the window and painted silver streaks across the floor. In that silent room in the middle of the barren desert, the most ruthless boss in Nevada was keeping watch over the sleep of a woman with whom he had never truly shared a conversation. When dawn began to blush across the desert horizon, Emilio bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to Vivian's forehead. His voice was a whisper, quiet enough that only the walls could hear. You're not alone anymore. I'm here. 14 hours later, Vivian Ashford opened her eyes. Warm light filled the room, utterly different from the cold fluorescent glare of hospital lights that had become so familiar to her through past emergency visits. A strange fragrance lingered in the air, not the scent of antiseptic or hospital linen, but the smell of pine wood mingled with the soft trace of lavender. Vivian blinked several times, trying to bring the world around her into focus as it slowly sharpened before her eyes. Her survival instinct rose at once. She didn't know where she was. She didn't remember what had happened. Her heart pounded wildly as she tried to sit up, but a sharp burst of pain shot through her head, making her let out a low cry before falling back against the pillow. Vivian lifted a hand to her forehead and felt the bandage wrapped carefully around her head. She looked down at her body and saw that the cuts on her arms had been cleaned and treated, and that her torn evening gown had been replaced with a soft cream-colored silk nightgown. Someone had taken care of her. Someone had changed her clothes. The thought filled her with both gratitude and panic. Vivian turned her head and looked around, trying to find any clue about where she was. The bedroom was spacious and luxurious, yet it didn't feel cold or distant the way the five-star hotels she had designed once did. The walls were painted a warm cream. The furniture was made of natural oak, and a bedside lamp cast a gentle golden light across the table beside the bed. The large window on the opposite side opened onto a sight that stole Vivian's breath, the vast desert stretching all the way to the horizon, golden dunes shimmering beneath the late afternoon sun. There were no buildings nearby, no sign of any other life. She was in the middle of nowhere. Footsteps sounded in the hallway and Vivian tensed at once, every sense sharpened into full alert. The bedroom door opened and a man appeared. He stood in the doorway without coming closer, as though he were deliberately keeping his distance so he wouldn't frighten her. Vivian recognized him immediately, even though she had never truly spoken to him before. He was the man she had seen at the auction night 4 months earlier, the one who had left behind the mysterious black business card she still kept in her wallet. He was still wearing the black suit from last night, the white shirt wrinkled now, the collar loosened. The dark shadows beneath his black eyes showed that he hadn't slept at all. His sharply cut face carried an air of exhaustion, yet at the same time, there was visible relief in him when he saw that she was awake. You're awake. His voice was low and rough, not a question but a statement. Vivian tried to sit up again. The pain still there, but she clenched her teeth and forced herself through it. Where am I? Who are you? What happened? The man stepped into the room, though he still kept several paces between them. You were attacked in the parking garage last night. I found you and brought you here. You're safe. Where is this? Why didn't you take me to a hospital? Because I don't trust hospitals. He answered without hesitation, but I do trust my doctor. She treated your injuries. Nothing is serious. You just need a few days of rest. Vivian stared at him, trying to read the man standing before her. There was something familiar in his eyes, in the way he stood, in the overwhelming presence he carried even without making a single threatening move. And then she remembered the black business card, the silver letters, "ER, you're the one who left the card that night at the auction." Vivian said, her voice both certain and questioning. Why? Emilio was silent for a moment, his dark eyes never leaving her face. You need to rest, we can talk later. Vivian shook her head, her stubbornness rising at once. No, I need to know where I am and why you're helping me. I don't know you, I don't owe you anything. She pushed back the blanket and swung her legs over the side of the bed, trying to stand. I don't need anyone to save me. I can take care of myself. But the moment she got to her feet, her head spun and her vision blurred in an instant. Her legs wouldn't obey her. They buckled beneath her. Vivian pitched forward, certain she was about to hit the floor face first, but that didn't happen. Strong arms caught her, holding her steady before she could fall. Vivian lifted her head and realized that Emilio's face was only inches from hers. It was the first time they had touched, while both of them were fully awake, and she could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of his cologne mixed with coffee. They froze in that position, looking at each other in silence. Vivian searched for danger in his dark eyes, searched for any sign of threat, but what she found left her unsettled. It wasn't cold calculation. It wasn't possessive hunger. It was worry, pure, sincere worry so unmistakable that it stunned her. I know you don't need anyone to save you, Emilio said, his voice dropping lower, but I need to save you. Vivian didn't understand what that meant. She wanted to ask, wanted to demand some explanation that made sense, but her strength was already gone, and the pounding in her head was beginning to return with greater force. Emilio gently helped her sit back down on the bed, adjusting the pillows behind her with a care Vivian wouldn't have expected from a man who looked as cold as he did. You're staying here until you're fully recovered, he said, and his voice was no longer a command, but carried some other note beneath it. Not an order, an offer. Vivian wanted to protest, wanted to say that she could take care of herself, that she didn't need help from anyone, but then she faced a bitter truth. She had nowhere to go. Her apartment was no longer safe if the attacker knew her address. She had no family to call, no close friends to turn to. In her emergency contact list, there was only one number, the number of the nearest hospital. After 12 years of living alone, she had grown used to handling everything by herself. But now, lying in a stranger's bed in the middle of the empty desert, she suddenly understood just how stark her loneliness truly was. All right, Vivian finally said, her voice no more than an exhausted whisper, for now. Emilio nodded and turned toward the door, but before he left, he stopped and spoke without looking back. If you need anything, I'm right in the room next door. The door closed, leaving Vivian alone with hundreds of unanswered questions. She looked out the window, where the desert was slowly sinking into dusk. She didn't know where she was, didn't know who that man truly was, didn't know why he cared about her, but there was one thing she knew for certain. For the first time in 12 years, someone was beside her. And that feeling, strange and frightening though it was, carried with it a small warmth she had thought she'd forgotten long ago. Vivian lay on the bed with her eyes fixed on the ceiling, letting memory carry her back 4 months. 4 months ago, amidst the gold-leafed opulence of the Bellagio, Vivian had been a ghost in her own creation, perfecting every light and shadow with obsessive care. She hadn't known that from the darkness of the back row, Emilio Rixai was watching her every move. He didn't bid $2 million for the paint on the canvas. He bought the vision of a woman who understood darkness as well as he did. The black business card left on her desk the next morning with its cryptic message about light and shadow hadn't been a call for work. It was a mark of recognition. Now, lying in this desert estate, the mystery was finally solved. He had noticed her long before she ever knew he existed. But as the desert sunset stained the horizon red, one question remained. Why would a man like him care so much for an ordinary architect like her? Vivian had no answer. The business card she had kept for 4 months was no longer just a small secret hidden in her wallet. It had become the doorway, leading her into an entirely new world, one she had never been prepared to enter. While Vivian rested in the room, flooded with the glow of the desert sunset, Emilio had already left the estate and called an emergency meeting. Not with lawyers or police, but with the people the outside world never even knew existed. Emilio's information network stretched across Las Vegas like invisible strands of a spider's web, slipping into every corner of that sinful city. From doormen at 5-star hotels to ordinary office workers, from hired hands in the financial world to nameless figures inside the legal system, every one of them owed Emilio a favor, and tonight was the night he called those debts due. 12 hours later, Emilio sat in the private office of the estate, a small room with glass walls overlooking the vast desert. In front of him lay a thick stack of documents, photographs, audio recordings, and one name circled in red ink, Raymond Cross. Emilio stared at the photograph of the man behind the attack, a 52-year-old man with carefully groomed silver hair, a polished smile, and cold gray eyes hidden behind gold-rimmed glasses. Cross was the chief executive officer of one of Nevada's largest real estate corporations, a familiar face in business magazines and at charity events. On the surface, he was the very image of success, a self-made businessman, a respected philanthropist, a model citizen of Las Vegas. But Emilio knew the truth behind that perfect facade. Cross was a bottomless creature of greed, willing to crush anyone in his path to get what he wanted, even an innocent woman like Vivian. The motive behind the attack slowly revealed itself as Emilio reviewed the documents. Vivian had just completed the design for a resort project worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a groundbreaking development any corporation would have wanted to possess. Cross had been targeting those designs for a long time, but Vivian had refused to work with him after discovering his unethical business practices. He couldn't accept being refused. The attack in the parking garage hadn't been meant to kill Vivian. The purpose was to steal the flash drive containing the entire set of plans, while also intimidating her into silence. The attackers had managed to get the flash drive, unaware that the files were dual encrypted, accessible only with a key Vivian kept hidden. But what truly filled Emilio with rage wasn't Cross. It was the traitor. Jenna, Vivian's assistant for the past 2 years, the young woman Vivian had trusted like a younger sister. She had sold every piece of information to Cross, from Vivian's work schedule and computer passwords to the location where she would appear that night. Jenna had been paid $100,000 to betray the woman who had rescued her from unemployment and given her a chance to build a career. Emilio looked at Jenna's photograph, a 26-year-old woman with an innocent face and a bright smile, and felt a wave of disgust rise in his throat. Betrayal from someone close always cut deeper than any blade, and Vivian would have to endure that pain when she learned the truth. There was one more piece of information that made Emilio understand Vivian had no way to win through legal channels. Judge Walter Hughes, one of the most prominent judges in Nevada, had long been in Cross's pocket. Any lawsuit Vivian might file would be dismissed. Any evidence she might gather would be ignored. The legal system she trusted had been completely bought, and she was only an ordinary architect with no family, no money, no power, standing alone against an empire of corruption. Emilio closed the file and lifted his dark eyes toward the desert sinking into darkness. He understood that feeling, the feeling of the whole world turning its back on you, the feeling that no one stood on your side. But Vivian wasn't alone anymore. She had him. Nico stepped into the room and stood straight at the door like a soldier awaiting orders. "We've confirmed everything, boss. Cross is at his estate in Henderson, around 6 bodyguards. We can handle it within 2 hours." Emilio didn't turn around. His low voice carried through the still room. "No rush, boss." Emilio rose and walked to the window, desert moonlight falling across his cold face. If I wanted Cross to disappear, he would have disappeared a long time ago, but that's too easy, too quick. He turned to look at Nico, his eyes lit with a cold, merciless gleam. "I want him to lose everything before he loses his freedom. His reputation first, then his money, then his power, one piece at a time, until he has nothing left but despair." Nico nodded, already familiar with the way Emilio dealt with enemies. But there was something in his boss's eyes that night that made him more curious than ever. "Is she really that important to you, boss?" Emilio didn't answer. He walked to the desk, opened a drawer, and took out a photograph. It was a picture of Vivian from the auction night 4 months earlier. Her face intent on her work, completely unaware that someone had been taking the photo. Emilio had kept that picture for 4 months, like a secret, even he didn't fully understand. "Prepare the plan," Emilio said, putting the photograph back into the drawer. "Start with Jenna. I want her to understand the price of betrayal." Nico lowered his head and left, leaving Emilio alone in the room washed in moonlight. He looked toward the door leading to Vivian's bedroom, where she was sleeping without the slightest idea that her life was about to change completely. She didn't know who her enemy truly was. She didn't know that the person she had trusted most had betrayed her. And she also didn't know that the stranger who had saved her the night before was willing to burn an entire empire to the ground just to protect her. Emilio poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat down in his chair, and began to plan. Cross wanted to play the game of greed. Fine. Emilio would show him what it meant to lose everything piece by piece until the man begged to be released. The next morning, when Vivian was clearer-headed and able to sit up without feeling dizzy, Emilio entered her room with a tablet in his hand. His face revealed no emotion, but his dark eyes carried something heavy that Vivian couldn't read. He sat down in the chair beside the bed, placed the tablet on her lap without saying a word. Vivian looked down at the screen, and what she saw made her heart feel as though it were being crushed. They were surveillance photographs of Jenna, her assistant, sitting in a coffee shop with a man in a gray suit. They were exchanging a thick envelope. Vivian swiped to the next image, and then the next. Phone messages between Jenna and an unknown number detailing Vivian's work schedule, the password to the company computer, and even the address of her private apartment. An email from Jenna to someone named Richard, confirming that Vivian would be staying late in the building that night because of the project launch. Everything was as clear as daylight. "Jenna," Vivian's voice trembled, no more than a broken whisper of pain. "That can't be possible. I trusted her. I trusted her like a sister." Emilio said nothing. He simply sat there in silence, giving her time to absorb the cruelty of the truth. Vivian remembered 2 years earlier when Jenna had come into her office with red-rimmed eyes and a crumpled job application in her hand. A young woman fresh out of school with no experience, no connections, only enthusiasm and a desperate hunger to learn. Vivian had given her a chance when no one else would. She had taught Jenna everything she knew, shared the secrets of the profession. Clear's throat, even lent her money when times were hard. And Jenna had sold her out for $100,000. Betrayal from someone close hurt more than any wound of the flesh. And Vivian felt as though someone had just driven a knife into her chest and twisted it slowly. Emilio swiped to the next screen, and a video began to play. Vivian recognized the man in it at once, Judge Walter Hughes, one of the most respected judges in Nevada. He was sitting in an elegant restaurant, accepting an envelope from a silver-haired man she also recognized, Raymond Cross, the head of Cross Enterprises, a real estate corporation. Vivian had once refused to work with Cross because she had heard rumors about the way he did business. And now, she understood that decision had turned her into his target. "This is the whole system," Emilio finally said, his voice low and rough. "Cross has people in the police, in the courts, in city government. If you sue him, the case will be dismissed. If you go to the police, they'll ignore it. If you try to fight through legal channels, you'll lose. Not because you're wrong, but because the system has been bought." Vivian let the tablet fall onto the bed, her hands trembling. She looked out the window where the vast desert stretched endlessly beneath the morning sun. 12 years. 12 years she had fought on her own, built her career with her own 2 hands, faced every hardship without leaning on anyone. And now she realized that no matter how hard she tried, there were forces she could never stand against alone. "Why are you doing all this?" Vivian turned to look at Emilio, her green eyes full of confusion. "You don't owe me anything. We hadn't even spoken before that night." Emilio was silent for a long moment, his black eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her want to look away. Then he answered, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it before. "Because there are things money can't buy, and you're one of them." Vivian didn't know how to respond to that. She wanted to ask more, wanted to understand the meaning behind his mysterious words, but Emilio continued, his tone returning to its usual coldness. "You have 2 paths," he said, rising to his feet and walking toward the window. "One you leave right now. I won't stop you. You'll go back to your old life, face Cross alone, and you'll lose. He'll take everything from you, your designs, your company, your reputation, and you won't have any way to fight back." He turned and looked at her, his gaze as sharp as a blade. 2, you stay here. Let me deal with Cross my way. He'll pay for what he did to you, but you need to understand one thing." He paused and his voice dropped lower. "My world isn't clean. I'm not a good man by ordinary definitions. If you stay, you'll be stepping into a world you've never known. Can you accept that?" Vivian looked at him, then looked out at the endless desert beyond the glass. She thought of the last 12 years, 12 years of loneliness, 12 years with no one standing beside her. She thought of Jenna, the woman she had trusted like a sister, betraying her for money. She thought of the legal system she had once believed in, now nothing more than a tool for the wealthy and powerful. And she thought of the man standing before her, the man who had pulled her out of the darkness, the man who had stayed awake all night watching over her sleep, the man offering her a choice no one else ever had. She stood and walked until she was standing in front of Emilio. Her green eyes no longer held panic or confusion. In their place was a determination even she hadn't known she possessed. "I've lived alone for too long," Vivian said, her voice steadier than it had ever been. "I don't know who to trust. I don't know who to lean on but you. You were here when I had no one. You didn't have to be, but you were." She drew in a long breath. "I'm staying." Emilio looked at her, and for one passing moment, Vivian saw something change in his dark eyes. The tension in his shoulders seemed to ease a little. The corner of his mouth moved faintly, not quite a smile, but close. "All right," he said, his voice still low but carrying a warmer note now. "Then we begin." He turned and walked out of the room, and Vivian watched his back until the door closed behind him. She didn't know what she had just stepped into. She didn't know what the future would become. But for the first time in 12 years, she didn't feel alone. And that feeling, strange and frightening though it was, carried something with it that she had forgotten long ago. Hope. The second week at the desert estate passed in a strange rhythm Vivian had never imagined she could grow used to. The wound on her head had almost completely healed, leaving only a faint scar hidden beneath her chestnut brown hair. She could move freely through the estate now, exploring every room, every corner of the garden, every window that looked out over the endless desert. Emilio remained busy with his mysterious work, but every evening he returned to have dinner with her. And every morning she found a fresh vase of flowers placed on the dining table. Vivian knew she could leave whenever she wanted. Emilio had made it clear that the choice was hers, but she stayed, partly because of safety and partly because of reasons she didn't dare admit even to herself. At 3 o'clock in the morning on a moonless night, Vivian woke with a sharp, gnawing hunger. She had skipped dinner because she had been so absorbed in reading a book in the library that she lost track of time. Now her stomach was protesting fiercely. She slipped on a light cardigan and quietly went downstairs, thinking the whole house was asleep and that she could find something to eat without disturbing anyone. But the moment Vivian stepped into the large kitchen, she froze where she stood. Emilio Rix, the most ruthless boss in Nevada, the man who made all of Las Vegas tremble, was standing in front of the gas stove with a black apron tied around him. He was holding a spatula as though it were a weapon, clears throughout his face drawn in a fierce concentration, as if he were facing an enemy he despised above all others. And in the skillet before him was something burning beyond recognition, smoke pouring upward, the smell of scorched eggs spreading through the kitchen. Vivian laughed. The sound escaped her throat before she could stop it, clear and natural, the first laugh she had given since the night she was attacked in the parking garage. Emilio turned sharply, his dark eyes widening in surprise. And Vivian could have sworn she saw a hint of color rise across his cheekbones, though she was almost certain she had imagined it because a mafia boss couldn't possibly blush, could he? "You're hungry," Emilio said, not asking but stating it as fact. Vivian stopped laughing and stared at him in surprise. "How did you know?" "You didn't eat dinner," he answered, his voice still calm, as though the fact that he noticed every meal she did or didn't eat was entirely ordinary. "And you always wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning when you're hungry. This is the third time this week." Vivian looked at him, then at the smoking skillet, then back at him again. Had he been watching her habits that closely? Had he come down to the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning just to cook for her, even though he so clearly had no idea how to cook at all? A strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she had forgotten a long time ago. "Let me," Vivian said, stepping closer and gently taking the spatula from his hand. Her fingers brushed his for the briefest moment, and she felt the warmth of his skin. "Sit down. This skillet needs saving before it turns into charcoal." Emilio obeyed with surprising ease, stepping back and sitting on the bar stool beside the counter. He watched Vivian clean up the disaster he had created, dump the burnt eggs into the trash, wash the skillet, and begin again from the start. She moved through the kitchen with smooth confidence, cracking eggs, seasoning them, toasting bread, brewing coffee, doing everything quickly and efficiently as though she had done it 1,000 times before. "You know how to cook," Emilio observed, a note of surprise in his voice. "I've lived alone since I was 16. Vivian answered without turning around. "If I didn't know how to cook, I would have starved a long time ago." 10 minutes later, she set down 2 plates of perfectly cooked eggs, crisp toast, and 2 hot cups of coffee on the counter. They sat beside each other in the soft yellow light, eating in silence. But it wasn't awkward at all. Outside the window, the desert lay buried in darkness, with only the stars glittering across the sky like millions of watchful eyes. Vivian set down her coffee cup and turned to look at Emilio. "You don't know how to be normal with someone, do you?" Emilio paused, his fork suspended in midair. He looked at her, and for this one moment his dark eyes hid nothing. "No," he admitted, his voice low and rough. "I don't know how to make small talk or do the ordinary things people usually do. I don't know how to care about someone without frightening them." He paused for a beat, then continued, his voice quieter. "But with you, I'm trying to learn." Vivian looked at him, the most powerful man in Las Vegas, sitting in the kitchen at 3 o'clock in the morning with a small burn on his finger because he had tried to cook eggs for her. A man who didn't know how to show care, yet was still trying in the most awkward way possible. And she smiled. The first smile she truly gave him, not because of surprise or amusement, but because she was beginning to see something in him she had never expected. Emilio Rixai wasn't only a cold-blooded mafia boss. He was a man who was trying, awkward and imperfect, but sincere in a way she had never encountered in anyone else. 2 weeks at the desert estate had changed many things between them in ways neither Vivian nor Emilio had expected. Shared meals, brief conversations in the hallway, and accidental encounters in the middle of the night had slowly built something neither of them dared to name. Trust, ease, and perhaps something deeper than that. That night, they sat on the living room balcony, the place with the widest view of the vast Nevada desert. The night sky was impossibly clear. Millions of stars glittering like diamonds scattered across an endless sheet of black velvet. The desert wind moved softly, carrying the chill of late night and the dry scent of sand. Vivian sat in a woven chair, both hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea, her eyes fixed on the boundless emptiness in the distance. Emilio sat beside her, silent as usual, but the silence between them no longer felt strained. It carried a strange peace now. Moonlight fell across his face, and Vivian noticed the faint scar running from his temple down to his left cheekbone. She had seen it from the first day, but had never asked. Now, in this private stillness, with the trust that had grown between them, she felt brave enough to find out. Without saying a word, Vivian set down her cup and turned toward Emilio. She lifted her hand, her fingers gently touching the scar, tracing its curve from his temple down to his cheek. His skin was warm beneath her fingertips, and she felt his body tighten slightly at her touch, but he didn't pull away. "Who did this?" Vivian asked, her voice no more than a whisper, as though she were afraid of breaking the quiet of the night. Emilio was silent for a long time, his dark eyes looking out into the distant emptiness. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than ever, carrying the weight of painful memories. "My mother." Vivian went still, her hand still resting against his cheek. Out of every answer she could have imagined, this was the one she never would have expected. Emilio turned to look at her, and in his eyes was the pain he had buried for 18 years. "She didn't want to hurt me, she wanted to save me." He drew in a deep breath and began to speak. When he was 15, his father, the man who led the Rixai family at that time, had ordered him to do something cruel to an innocent person. It was a test. His father said, a way to prove he was worthy of inheriting the family's empire. But Emilio had refused. He couldn't harm someone who'd done nothing wrong, even if it meant defying his own father. In their world, mercy was seen as weakness, and weakness was unforgivable. His father had punished him brutally for that disobedience, and he had almost not survived. Emilio didn't go into detail, but Vivian could hear the pain in every word, in the way his voice shook even as he tried to control it. Then his mother had done something no one expected. She, the gentle woman who had never dared to defy her husband, had knelt before Emilio's father and asked to punish her son with her own hands. She had left the scar on his face, the scar Vivian was touching now. Then she had knelt before her husband and said, "He has been punished. This scar will remind him for the rest of his life that mercy has its price." His father had spared Emilio's life. The innocent person had been set free, but the price his mother paid was heavier than any wound left on flesh. She died 3 years later. Emilio said, his voice tightening as though it were being crushed from within. "She never forgave herself for hurting me, even though it was the only way to save me." Silence covered the balcony. Vivian looked at the man sitting before her, the most powerful mafia boss in Nevada, and for the first time, she saw the 15-year-old boy still living inside him. The boy who had been forced to grow up too soon, who had buried his mercy in order to survive, who had carried that scar on his face as a permanent reminder of the price of compassion in a brutal world. Vivian said nothing. There were no words that could soften the pain he had carried for 18 years. Instead, she did what instinct told her to do. She leaned forward and gently pressed her lips to his scar, a kiss as light as butterfly wings, carrying no passion and no desire, only the healing she wanted to offer the boy he had once been. When she drew back, Vivian looked straight into Emilio's eyes and said, "This isn't the scar of weakness. It's proof that you once had mercy, and that someone loved you enough to suffer in your place." Emilio closed his eyes, and Vivian saw something she never thought she would witness. A tear, the first in 18 years, slipped down his cheek, tracing the scar his mother had left behind. "You're the first person to touch it without hesitation," he whispered, his voice rough and broken. "Everyone else looks at it with fear or disgust, but you look at it as though it's a part of me that deserves to be loved." Vivian took his hand and laced her fingers through his. She didn't know what to say, so she simply stayed there beside him in a silence that needed no words. That night, they sat together on the balcony until dawn painted the desert horizon pink. Neither of them spoke again, but in the space between them an invisible thread had been tied fast. Two lonely people, both wounded by the past, were beginning to find healing in each other. That night, Emilio came home later than usual. An emergency meeting with his associates had stretched on until nearly midnight, and when he stepped into the estate, the house was already buried in darkness. He meant to go straight to his room, but a faint light coming from the kitchen made him stop. Emilio moved silently in that direction, and the sight that greeted him made his heart feel as though an invisible hand had closed around it. Vivian was sitting alone on the dark kitchen floor, her back against the refrigerator, her knees drawn up to her chest. In front of her was a tiny cupcake resting on a paper plate, and on top of it, a candle had already burned itself out, leaving behind only a small pool of white wax hardening over the frosting. She wasn't crying. She was simply sitting there, her green eyes empty as she watched the wax drip downward, as though she were watching time pass with no way to hold it still. Emilio stood in the doorway, silently watching her in the dark. Then he spoke, his voice gentler than ever. "Today is your birthday." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Vivian wasn't surprised to see him. She only lifted her head and gave him a sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I bought it at a convenience store on the way home." she said, her voice flat, as though she were commenting on the weather. It's been a habit for 12 years. Emilio said nothing. He walked into the kitchen, took off his expensive suit jacket and draped it over a chair without a second thought, then sat down on the cold floor beside her. His shoulder touched hers, his presence warm in the dark kitchen. Ever since my parents died, no one remembers my birthday. Vivian began, her voice sounding as though it came from somewhere very far away. The first year I waited, I thought maybe someone would remember, a friend, an acquaintance, anyone, but no one did. She drew in a trembling breath. The second year, I bought myself a cake. I lit a candle, sang happy birthday to myself, and pretended someone was there with me. I even wrote a card and signed someone else's name, just so I wouldn't feel so alone. By the third year, I stopped pretending. Her voice dropped lower. I accepted that this was my life. A small cake, one candle, alone in the dark, 12 years, never changing. Emilio didn't know what to say. In his world, he was used to solving problems with power, with money, with strength. But her loneliness wasn't something he could defeat, so he simply sat there beside her in the darkness, letting her know she wasn't alone. They sat in silence for an hour. Neither of them spoke. There was only the sound of the desert wind moving softly beyond the window and the steady sound of their breathing. At last, Vivian spoke, her voice no more than a whisper. This is the first birthday I haven't felt alone. Emilio turned to look at her. His dark eyes lit in the darkness. From now on, you never will again. I promise. Vivian gave a faint smile, a smile touched by sorrow and gratitude. Then she kept speaking as though the door to memory had opened and she could no longer close it. There was one person who used to remember my birthday, Sophie. She told him about Sophie, the girl she had met at the orphanage when she was 16. Sophie had been 2 years younger, shy and often bullied. Vivian had protected her like a little sister and they had become inseparable. On the night before Vivian left the orphanage to begin life on her own, they had promised each other that one day, when they were both grown, they would buy a small house and live together. They wouldn't need anyone else. They would only need each other. But fate hadn't allowed that to happen. Sophie had been adopted at 16 by a wealthy family. They had cut off all contact with her past, changed her phone number, moved away, as though they wanted to erase every trace of the orphanage from her life. Vivian had spent 5 full years searching for Sophie, knocking on office doors, sending letters to every possible address, never once giving up hope. I found her in the end. Vivian's voice broke and tears began to slide down her cheeks. In the obituary section of a local newspaper, Sophie had died at 19. Life inside her new family had been too harsh for her, impossible expectations, loneliness in the middle of luxury, and the ache of missing the sister she was never able to find again. She had left behind only one line before she died. I'm sorry I couldn't find you, Vivian. Vivian cried, not with the kind of broken sobs she had held back for years, but with silent tears that wouldn't stop falling while her body trembled. It was the first time she had cried in front of someone since her parents died. She had always been strong, always self-reliant, always buried her pain deep inside herself. But tonight, in the dark kitchen in the middle of the empty desert, beside the man she had never thought she could trust, she finally allowed herself to fall apart. Emilio said nothing. He only pulled her into his arms, letting her rest her head against his chest, one arm wrapped tightly around her back, while the other stroked her chestnut brown hair. He didn't know what words could ease the pain she had carried for so many years, but he understood now. Now he understood why she worked as though her life depended on it, why she had built her career with such ruthless determination. She was trying to become someone strong enough that she would never lose anyone again, so she would never again be as helpless as she had been when she lost Sophie. You won't lose anyone else, Emilio whispered into her hair, his voice like a vow. I won't let that happen. They remained there in the darkness until dawn began to slip through the window. And in the arms of the man who had once been a stranger, Vivian felt for the first time that perhaps, just perhaps, she didn't have to fight alone anymore. Raymond Cross wasn't the kind of man to sit still and wait for death. When he discovered that Emilio Rixai was quietly investigating him, he knew he had to strike first if he didn't want to lose everything. In this world, the one who attacked first held the advantage, and Cross had lived long enough to understand that. He hired professionals from outside the city, men no one in Emilio's network would recognize, and ordered them to act on the night Emilio drove back to the desert estate alone. That night, Vivian stood on the balcony, gazing at the star-filled sky as she often did. She was waiting for Emilio to come home, a new habit she didn't dare admit even to herself. The estate was silent, with only the desert wind moving softly through the cactus bushes, and then she heard it. A strange sound rose from the road leading back to the estate, the noise of metal crashing, tires grinding over sand, and then a sudden silence. Vivian's heart began to beat faster, unease rising in her chest. Instinct told her that something was wrong. She didn't think. She ran down the stairs and rushed out the front door, her bare feet striking the cold sand without her even noticing. Moonlight lit her way as she ran toward the sound, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. And then she saw it. Emilio's car was tilted into the roadside ditch, the headlights still glowing dimly into the emptiness, the windshield shattered, one side of the vehicle badly crushed. Vivian ran to it, her heart nearly stopping when she looked inside. Emilio was slumped in the driver's seat, his head fallen forward, the shoulder of his white shirt stained a deep dark red. He was hurt. He was hurt and couldn't get himself out. For one brief moment, fear nearly swallowed her whole, but then she remembered the night she had lain in the parking garage, alone and hopeless, and someone had come to save her. Now it was her turn. Vivian didn't panic. She became calm in a way that startled even her, as though someone else had taken over her body and was guiding every move. She pulled at the car door, trying to force it open, and when it wouldn't give, she climbed in through the shattered window without any concern for the jagged pieces of glass. She reached Emilio, checked his breathing, and let out a shaky breath of relief when she felt the faint warmth of air against her skin. He was still alive. "Emilio, look at me," she said, her voice firm as both hands held his face and forced him to focus. "You have to stay awake. Do you hear me?" Emilio opened his eyes, his dark gaze blurred with pain, but it still found her. "Vivian, don't say anything. I'm calling Helena." She pulled out her phone and dialed Emilio's private doctor, whose number she had saved for emergencies. While waiting, she took off her thin cardigan, folded it, and pressed it against the wound in his shoulder to stop the bleeding. He groaned in pain, but she didn't let up. "Talk to me," she told him, knowing she had to keep him conscious until the doctor arrived. "Don't you dare close your eyes, Emilio. You promised I'd never be alone on my birthday again. You haven't kept that promise yet. You can't leave me now." Emilio looked at her, the corner of his mouth lifting even through the pain. "You're holding me to my word even now. Do you have a better idea for keeping you awake?" She shot back, her voice sharp, though her eyes were full of worry. They kept talking about paint colors, about lighting, about meaningless design details. Vivian knew Emilio didn't care about it all, but he listened, his eyes never leaving her, as though she were the only anchor keeping him tied to this world. "You didn't run," Emilio whispered, his voice rough and strained. "Why would I run?" Vivian answered, her hands still pressing hard against his wound. "Because this was your best chance to get away from me, away from this world. No one would have blamed you." He looked at her with something she couldn't quite read. "You could leave right now, pretend you never knew me, and go live a normal life." Vivian stopped moving and looked straight into his eyes. "Maybe I don't want to get away." Emilio said nothing, but she saw his eyes brighten in the darkness. 20 minutes later, Dr. Helena arrived with her medical team. They pulled Emilio out of the car, treated the wound, and brought him back to the estate. Helena said he had been lucky. The injury wasn't life-threatening, but he would need several weeks of rest. Before the sedative pulled him into sleep, Emilio caught Vivian's hand and held it tightly, as though he were afraid she might disappear. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice weak. Vivian bent down and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. "I told you, I'm not going anywhere." That night, Vivian sat in the chair beside Emilio's bed, just as he had sat beside hers on the first night she had come to this estate. She watched his face in sleep, the scar on his cheek touched by moonlight through the window, and she realized something. What existed between them was no longer one-sided. It wasn't simply that he had saved her or that she owed him anything. They were protecting each other now, caring for each other, staying beside each other in the dark. And to Vivian, that was worth more than any promise. Raymond Cross was a survivor. When the surprise attack failed and Emilio was still alive, he knew he couldn't win by force. The Mafia boss was too powerful, too well protected, and now had even more reason to destroy him. But Cross wasn't a man who gave up easily. He had spent his entire life climbing to the top by stepping on other people, and he wasn't about to let someone like Emilio Rixai drag him down. If he couldn't destroy Emilio with strength, he would destroy him from the inside, and he knew exactly what Emilio's weakness was. Vivian Ashford. 1 week after the attack, when Emilio had recovered enough to walk again, an unmarked envelope was delivered to the estate. Inside was a thick file and a handwritten letter from Cross. Emilio read through the contents, and every line felt like a blade driven straight into his chest. When he finished, he sat there in silence for an hour, the file resting on his lap, his dark eyes fixed on nothing with an emptiness Nico had never seen in his boss before. The truth inside that file could destroy everything Emilio had built with Vivian. Vivian's father, Marcus Ashford, hadn't died in a car accident 12 years earlier the way she had always believed. He was alive, living in Montana with a new family, a new wife, and 2 new children. He had run away, leaving his 16-year-old daughter alone to face the world, leaving her to cry through the night and wonder why she had been abandoned. But that wasn't even the worst part. The reason Marcus Ashford had to run was because he owed money to the Mafia, a massive debt from gambling losses, failed investments, and a lavish lifestyle he couldn't afford to maintain. And the Mafia he owed wasn't anyone else but the Rixai family, Emilio's father, the man who had led the criminal empire before Emilio took over. When Marcus couldn't repay the debt, Emilio's father had ordered the Ashford family to be dealt with as a warning to others. Vivian's mother didn't survive that night, and her father had escaped, leaving his little daughter behind, never to return. Cross's letter was short and merciless. Tell her the truth, or I'll release it all to the press. Let's see if she still looks at you that way when she knows your family destroyed her life. Emilio stood before the hardest choice of his life. If he told the truth, Vivian might never forgive him. She might look at him with hatred instead of the trust he had grown used to seeing in her eyes. He could lose her forever. But if he hid the truth, Cross would make everything public, and Vivian would learn that he had lied to her. That betrayal would be even worse than the truth itself. Emilio chose to tell her, not because it was the easy choice, but because he couldn't build anything with her on a foundation of lies. That evening, he found Vivian in the reading room. She was sitting by the window with a novel in her hands, the soft yellow light falling across her chestnut brown hair. She looked up when she saw him and gave him a warm smile, one he knew might be the last he would ever see. There's something I need to tell you, Emilio began, his voice heavy, as though every word was a burden. And you aren't going to want to hear it. Vivian's smile faded. She set the book down, her green eyes fixed on him with concern. What is it? Emilio sat down in the chair across from her, and he began to tell her about her father being alive, about his new family in Montana, clear his throat about the debt to the Rixai family, about her mother, about the truth she had never known for 12 years. He hid nothing, offered no excuses, made no attempt to soften the truth. He simply told her every painful detail and watched the light in her eyes slowly go out. When he stopped, Vivian sat there like a stone statue. Her face was pale, her eyes empty as they stared into the distance. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she simply sat there, and her silence was more terrifying than any fury could have been. My father is alive, her voice finally came, shaking as though every word were a wound. For 12 years I thought he was dead. I cried every night. I kept asking why I'd been left alone. I tried to live well enough that he'd be proud of me if he were looking down from heaven. And he was still alive. She rose to her feet and stepped back from Emilio as though he were the source of every pain she had ever known. And your family caused my family's tragedy? My mother died because of your father. Vivian, I didn't know any of this until today, Emilio said, his voice full of pain. I had nothing to do with what happened 12 years ago, but I understand if you can't forgive me. Vivian looked at him, and in her eyes was something Emilio couldn't bear to endure. It wasn't hatred. It was loss, as though she had just lost something precious she thought she had finally found. I need time, she said, her voice sounding as though it came from somewhere far away. I can't think right now. She turned and walked away without looking back. Emilio stayed where he was, watching her disappear beyond the door, and he didn't follow. He knew she needed space, needed time to absorb the brutal truth he had just laid before her. 3 days passed. Vivian didn't make contact. She had left the estate that very night, without a message, without telling anyone where she was going. Emilio didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He only sat in the dark office, staring at the photograph of Vivian he had kept for 4 months. Nico stood outside the door and didn't dare go in, because for the first time in 10 years, he saw that his boss was no longer the cold mafia lord. Emilio was only a man waiting for the woman he loved to come back, not knowing whether she ever would. Vivian arrived in Montana on a late autumn afternoon, when golden leaves were falling along the quiet road leading into the outskirts of a small town. She used cash from an emergency fund to buy a plane ticket, avoiding her credit cards so that neither Emilio nor Cross could track her location. The address in the file he had given her led to a charming little house at the end of a peaceful street, with a white fence around a lush green yard and a swing hanging beneath the branches of an old oak tree. It was nothing like what Vivian had imagined. She had thought her father would be living in hiding, in some rundown apartment in a remote place, but this was a beautiful, warm home filled with the kind of love she could feel even from the outside. Vivian stood across the road, hidden behind a tree, watching the house for nearly an hour. She saw her father, Marcus Ashford, the man she had mourned for 12 years, step out into the yard with a woman far younger than her mother had been. They were followed by 2 children, a little boy about 8 and a little girl around 5, laughing and playing across the grass. Marcus pushed the swing for the little girl, a radiant smile on his face as though he were the happiest man in the world. His new wife stood beside him with one arm around his waist and her head resting on his shoulder. They looked like the perfect family on the cover of a magazine. Vivian felt as though her heart were being crushed in her chest. 12 years. For 12 years she had believed he was dead. For 12 years she had tried to live well enough to make him proud if he were looking down from heaven. And through Clear's throat all those 12 years he had been here, living happily with a new family as though she had never existed. Vivian drew in a deep breath and crossed the street. She walked to the gate, rang the bell, and waited. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest, but she kept her face calm. She needed answers. She deserved the truth. The door opened, and Marcus Ashford stood there, the smile on his lips freezing the instant he recognized who was standing before him. His face drained of color, and his eyes widened with a fear Vivian had never expected to see. "Vivian," he whispered, his voice tightening in his throat. 12 years, Vivian said, her voice even but carrying an ocean of pain beneath it. "For 12 years, I thought you were dead. I cried every night. I tried to survive on my own from the time I was 16. I kept asking why God had taken everyone from me." Marcus swallowed hard, his eyes flicking back toward the house where the laughter of his wife and children could still be heard. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and hurried. "The past should stay in the past. You need to leave right now." Vivian felt as though she had just been struck across the face. "The past? Am I your past? I'm your daughter, I'm your blood." Marcus looked at her, and in his eyes there was no regret, no longing, only the irritation of a man whose past had come back to disturb him. "I have a new life now," he said, his tone growing harder. "My wife, my children, they know nothing about my past, and I want to keep it that way." "What about my mother?" Vivian asked, her voice trembling. "She didn't survive because of you. You ran and left her behind. Do you remember her? Have you ever even thought about her?" Marcus was silent for a moment, and then he said the words Vivian would never forget. "Your mother has been in the past for a long time. You should go live your own life instead of digging up things that are dead and buried." Then he closed the door, right in her face. Not a single apology, not a single tear, not a single embrace, just a white wooden door slamming shut, cutting her off from the man she had called father for 12 years. Vivian stood there, staring at the door in front of her. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply stood there in absolute emptiness, as though someone had reached inside her body and pulled out her soul. Her father hadn't died. He had chosen to abandon her. He had been given the chance to explain, to apologize, to show even the smallest scrap of love still left in him, but he had chosen to close the door. He had chosen his new family over his own daughter. Rain began to fall while Vivian was still standing in front of that house. She looked through the brightly lit window and saw her father sitting at the dinner table with his new family. They were laughing together in warmth, completely unaware that outside in the cold rain and darkness, his real daughter was standing alone. At last, Vivian turned and walked away, the rain blending with the tears on her face. On the way back to the airport, sitting in an old taxi, Vivian thought about all the people who had left her. Her mother, who hadn't survived that fateful night. Sophie, her only true friend, who had died at just 19 years old. And now her father, who hadn't died at all but had chosen to leave her behind and live another life. But then she thought about Emilio, the man who had saved her when she had no one, the man who had told her the painful truth, even though he knew it might cost him her, the man who hadn't chased after her when she left because he respected her decision, the only one who was still there, waiting for her, whether she chose to return or not. Emilio wasn't perfect. His world wasn't clean. His family had caused her family's tragedy, but he was the only one who had never chosen to leave her. And in that moment, in the middle of the cold Montana rain, Vivian realized something important. She knew what she had to do. Raymond Cross was not a man who knew how to give up. When he learned that Vivian had left Las Vegas alone for Montana, he recognized it as his final opportunity. Emilio was weakening because he had lost Vivian, his spirit collapsing, his concentration fading, and Vivian was alone with no one protecting her, no bodyguards, no mafia boss at her side. Cross had men watching her from the moment she set foot in Montana, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. On the road back to Clear's Throat, Las Vegas from the Montana airport, after her plane landed, and Vivian drove the rental car back toward the city, her vehicle was blocked on a deserted stretch of road outside town. 2 black sport utility vehicles appeared from both directions, cutting her off in front and behind. Vivian tried to fight back, but she was only an architect, not a warrior. She was taken to a secret location, an abandoned steel factory on the edge of the desert, where no one could hear her cries for help. Meanwhile, at the desert estate, Emilio still sat in the darkness as he had for the past 3 days, waiting for Vivian to return, even though he didn't know whether she ever would. His phone rang, an unfamiliar number flashing on the screen. Emilio answered, and Raymond Cross's voice came through, thick with pleasure. "I have what you value most." Emilio's heart seemed to stop. He gripped the phone so hard the casing gave a sharp crack beneath his hand. "If you want to see her again, come to the old steel factory north of Henderson, alone. No weapons, no bodyguards, just you." Cross continued, his voice cold as ice. "If I see anyone else, if I so much as catch the scent of a suspicious vehicle, she'll never be seen again. Do you understand?" Emilio didn't answer. He ended the call, and in that instant, the memory he had buried for 18 years came crashing back like a tidal wave. Meisha's, his younger brother. That year, he had received a call just like this one. The The men who had taken his brother had also demanded that he come alone, had also promised they would release Macias if he obeyed. He had followed every demand, but Macias had still never come home. His brother had died at only 12 years old, and Emilio had carried that pain for nearly 2 decades. No, he whispered into the darkness, his voice shaking. Not this time, not her. Nico entered the room when he heard the noise. Boss, what happened? Emilio told Nico about the call, his voice calm in a way that was more frightening than rage. Nico objected at once. It's a trap, boss. Cross knows you'll come, and he'll be ready. You can't go alone, Nico said, his voice urgent. Let us handle it. We can gather men within an hour, surround that factory from every side. You don't need to risk your life. If Cross sees anyone else, she'll be in danger. Emilio answered, his voice stripped of its usual coldness. Do you understand? I lost Macias because I didn't act fast enough. I won't lose anyone else. But boss, this is not a discussion. Emilio rose to his feet, his eyes fixed on Nico. The man who had followed him for 10 years, who had protected him through countless dangers, was now looking at him with eyes full of worry. Emilio placed a hand on Nico's shoulder and his voice softened. If I don't come back, he paused for a beat. Everything belongs to Vivian. This estate, the company, the bank accounts, all of it. Protect her. Make sure she's safe and help her build a new life far from this world. Boss, I can't let you go alone. Nico pleaded, his voice tightening in his throat. That's my final order, Emilio said, leaving no room for protest. Nico stood there, his fists clenched tight, but at last he lowered his head. Yes, boss. Emilio drove alone through the Nevada desert in the dark of night. No weapon, no bodyguards, no backup plan, only him and the endless road stretched out before him. Desert wind slipped through the half-open window, cold as the breath of death. Along the way, he thought of Vivian, of 4 months ago when he had first seen her on the auction night, her green eyes bright as she worked with absolute passion. Of the night he found her in the parking garage, her chestnut brown hair stained with blood, her pale face still breathtakingly beautiful. Of the nights they sat together on the balcony, looking at the stars and sharing secrets they had never told anyone else. Of her smile, her laugh, the way she looked at him as though he weren't a mafia boss at all, but only an ordinary man worthy of being loved. Emilio was ready to trade his life for hers, without hesitation, without regret. The abandoned steel factory rose before him like a giant beast sleeping in the darkness. Rusted smokestacks reached into the black sky, and corroded iron doors groaned in the wind. Emilio stopped the car, stepped out, and faced the dark. He knew Cross was waiting inside. He knew it could be a trap. He knew he might never walk out of that place again. But Vivian was in there too. And that was enough for him to keep moving forward. This time, I won't lose anyone else. Emilio whispered to himself, then stepped into the darkness. Emilio stepped into the abandoned steel factory, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. The smell of rusted metal and dust filled the air, while faint shafts of light from shattered windows fell across the cracked concrete floor, creating ghostly streaks in the thick blackness. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the eerie silence, and then he saw them. Raymond Cross stood in the middle of the factory with 6 bodyguards in black beside him, their weapons aimed directly at Emilio. And behind Cross, Vivian sat on an iron chair, her hands bound behind her back, a cloth gag tied over her mouth. There was a bruise on her cheekbone, clear proof that she had fought fiercely when they took her. But her green eyes still burned bright, holding no trace of fear, only anger and determination. Cross gave Emilio a triumphant smile when he saw him. So, you finally came, the most powerful mafia boss in Las Vegas, coming here alone like an obedient dog because of a woman. He let out a mocking laugh. Pathetic, love makes people weak. Emilio said nothing. His dark eyes moved across the space, assessing the situation. 6 bodyguards, cross-armed, Vivian held captive. He had no weapon, no backup, a hopeless position. Let her go, Emilio said at last, his voice calm in a way that was more frightening than rage. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Money, territory, the casinos, everything I have. Cross shook his head, amused. You still don't understand, do you? I don't need your money, I don't need your territory, then my life. Emilio said without the slightest hesitation. Let her go and you can do whatever you want to me. Cross lifted a brow, genuinely surprised. You'd trade your life for hers? Without hesitation. Cross laughed loudly, the sound ringing through the hollow factory. Magnificent. The most ruthless mafia boss in Nevada, ready to die for love. But do you understand? I don't want those things. The only thing I want is to watch you collapse, to watch you lose what you value most. He turned toward Vivian, pulled out his weapon, and threatened her with it. Vivian closed her eyes, but she didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't call out for Emilio to save her. She simply sat there in silence, as though she were waiting for something. Look, Cross said to Emilio, his voice dripping with pleasure. Look at her one last time, see whether your love can save her. But Cross had made a fatal mistake. He was too focused on Emilio, too drunk on his own victory, and he hadn't paid attention to the woman behind him. During all the time she had been held there, Vivian hadn't sat still waiting to be rescued. She had used the metal hairpin Emilio had given her, the one she always wore in her hair, to quietly loosen the ropes. Little by little, strand by strand, she had freed her hands without anyone noticing. And the moment Cross turned his back to face Emilio, Vivian moved. She tore herself free of the ropes, sprang up and slammed the iron chair into Cross's back with all her strength. He staggered and the weapon fell to the ground. Before anyone could react, Vivian lunged forward, snatched it up, and pointed it straight at Cross's face. "Don't move." Her voice rang through the factory, cold and decisive. The 6 bodyguards turned their weapons toward her, but Vivian didn't tremble. She stood firm, both hands steady on the gun, her green eyes blazing in the darkness. Cross stared at her, his face drained of color in shock. "You know how to use a gun? I've lived alone since I was 16 in the worst parts of the city."